Hi, everybody. This is Karen here. And today I'm going to talk about how to write syntax goals when you are doing speech therapy. So, if you struggle to write language goals for your therapy, what I'm about to share with you will make your job substantially easier because it does involve a mini IEP goal bank. Now, of course, it's not what you would traditionally expect in a goal bank, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. But let's talk about how we can use this bank and what students this would be appropriate for. So, if you have students who can't get their ideas across and don't sound right when they're talking, maybe something sounds off or disorganized or incomplete, and you can't always figure out what's wrong, then chances are, if you have students like that, their problems might be related to syntax. So these are the kids that teachers often refer to you with quote unquote processing difficulties. So their reading and writing skills may be poor. They may struggle to follow directions. So as it turns out, this is not a coincidence because syntactic skills are proven to be correlated with both reading and listening comprehension skills. And this makes perfect sense if you think about it, because we won't be able to understand sentences when we're reading or hearing them if we don't understand how they're put together. And the same goes for writing. If we don't understand sentence structure, the sentences we say will be pretty disorganized. So when we're working with these kinds of students, it can be really hard to write syntax goals and really fine tune the skills that we should be working on, because there are so many different sentence structures that we have to use. So even if we are using one of those pre-made goal banks out there, it can still be kind of hard to figure out what we should do. And one of the reasons why this happens when it comes to syntax is, again, if you're anything like me, I found it hard to teach syntactic structure because I didn't know syntactic rules myself. And maybe I was effectively using some of these sentence structures, but I wasn't really paying attention. And so because I wasn't really paying attention to the sentence structures that might be a little bit more difficult, and I didn't really know them explicitly myself, it was really hard for me to teach them to my students. So let me rephrase that. It's not that I didn't know them in the sense that I wasn't able to communicate effectively. It's that I knew them so well implicitly that I couldn't explain them explicitly, which is what my students needed. So I was using all kinds of complex sentence structures because I intuitively knew how and when to use them, but I didn't have the ability to explain what I was doing. So if you have this problem too, you'll want to keep listening, because I'm going to talk about how to hone in on those difficult sentence types that we need to focus on. And I'll even give you the start of what I would call a mini goal bank. And in this blog post series that you are listening to right now, I do create an IEP goal bank if you go through and read all the articles. And the entire 5-article series is called Syntax Goals for Speech Therapy. So to be honest, if you actually read through these and if you really understand syntax, and if I give you enough information about syntax goals, you won't really need an IEP goal bank if you have that underlying skill set and you really understand what your students need to be working on. But having said that, I like to create mini goal banks from time to time for you because I know sometimes it's just easier to have them as a go-to resource. So before we dive into how we should write syntax goals, we need to prioritize. Because if your students are struggling with sentence structure, that list of error patterns that you're finding can seem endless, and we don't have time to get to them all, nor do we need to. So that's why for syntax, it's necessary to examine the types of sentences that are most difficult to process, because these are the ones that will give our students with language impairments the biggest headaches. So part of the reason I'm giving you this goal bank and this article series is that I can help you to know those high priority skills that you should be targeting in therapy. Because if we're aware of the biggest culprits behind these processing difficulties, this can narrow our focus considerably. It can also make our therapy more effective because we're hitting the skills holding our students back in the first place. So thankfully, Dr. Richard Zappoli cleared up some confusion when it comes to syntax with an article that he wrote. And I came across this article on Smart Speech Therapy's Facebook page back in April of 2017. And if you go to the original post that I am reading to you right now, you will find a link to that Facebook post. And you'll also be able to find the full reference for the Zappoli article, although I'm going to give you a pretty in-depth review of what it said. So the majority of this article series focuses on what sentence types we need to address for students with speech and language impairments. So we know that our students have a poor sense of sentence structure and they can't get their ideas across effectively because they have disorganized language. So when they read, books don't make sense to them because the sentences are not structured the way that they would say them. So one of the best things you as an SLP can do to build syntax is to target those specific sentence structures that tend to be difficult for students with language disorders. And those 4 challenging sentence types are, according to Zappoli's research, are sentences with passive voice, sentences with adverbial clauses and temporal or causal conjunctions, sentences with center-embedded relative clauses, and sentences with 3 or more clauses. So before you start feeling overwhelmed when you hear that list, you kind of have to just take a deep breath and relax, because when I saw these terms, I had to review them myself. So don't feel like you're a slacker because you don't walk around all day thinking about center embedding and relative pronouns and all of those things. So if you aren't sure what some of these things are right off the bat, don't worry. You'll have plenty of time to look them up and have enough information that you can help your students with them, because I will also go through that in this 5-post series. But before we do any of that, I am going to get on my soapbox for a minute about IEP Goal Banks, mostly because I hate Goal Banks and I've never really used one. My IEP Goal Bank is essentially in my head. And I think that over-reliance on IEP Goal Banks has caused us to focus too much on paperwork and can actually be a crutch for people who aren't quite sure what skills they should be targeting. But having said that, I do provide a version of an IEP Goal Bank for my students in my Language Therapy Advanced program. And I offer some mini IEP Goal Banks within some of the free articles on my site, which is what I'm going to start for you today. And I do this because I think using a list of goals as a swipe file can keep you efficient, as long as you're not using it as a crutch and you understand how to write good goals in the first place. I think they can be a useful tool in that sense. So keep that in mind. So with all that said, let's get back to writing good goals for syntax for speech therapy. So obviously the first step is understanding these 4 difficult sentence types, because we want our goals for syntax to tie back to those sentence types. But what I do first is I start out with a base goal, and that's just a general goal that addresses sentence structure. So we're not even talking about any of those 4 sentence types yet. So a base goal is a simple statement that identifies a behavior that you can physically observe. So it's just pretty general, and it's our starting point before we really fine tune. And at this point, we're just saying that we are working on syntax. We're not really saying what specific syntactic skill that we're addressing. And when I come up with this base goal, to basically organize myself and figure out how I'm going to actually target this. I use the mantra, if you can't see someone doing it, you can't track it. So you can't measure what you can't see. So any type of base goal that you're going to write in an IEP goal, you have to be able to physically see someone doing it. So if you use verbs like will understand sentence structures, will comprehend, you can't see someone comprehending or understanding. So that doesn't really help. You have to state the behavior that shows that they'll be comprehending or understanding. So how I do this when I do this with my language therapy advanced students is that I only give them 6 base language goals. And that covers the majority of the skills you might need to address with school-age children when it comes to language. So that base goal is key because it helps you to stay focused on the big picture and helps organize you as you sort through that massive number of goals you potentially could be targeting in therapy. So I am just going to share one of those base goals with you today when it comes to syntax that will kind of focus us when it comes to targeting things like these 4 difficult sentence types that Zapoli has outlined for us. So for syntax, our base goal will be student will say or write sentences. Literally, it's that simple. So if you can remember this one, insanely obvious behavior when you're writing your syntax goals, you're well ahead of the game. So what we're doing when we are working on syntax, we either want our student to say sentences with the correct syntax or write correct sentences with the correct syntax. So I know that that just kind of seems just incredibly obvious. But really understanding those base behaviors is the meat of writing good goals because so many people overcomplicate this to death. Now, you could have a comprehension goal. So, for example, you might have a goal that would have to do with maybe identifying a picture that goes with a sentence or maybe answer a question about a sentence. But you can really work those into other comprehension goals. When we're really directly targeting syntax, the ultimate thing we want our students to do is to say and write sentences correctly. Now, of course, it would be ideal to get a little bit more specific than this. So we're going to take that base goal behavior, student will say / write sentences, and just make it a little bit more specific to clarify that when we want students to say or write sentences, that we want them to use correct syntax. So all you would say in that case is student will say / write sentences with appropriate syntax. So obviously, I'm not giving you the entire format of the goal. You'd obviously want to make sure that you add the appropriate level of accuracy, like 4 out of 5 trials or 80% accuracy. Or you might need to list something like, we'll do with 80% accuracy on 3 consecutive sessions or something like that. So obviously you want to add that as well. But I think why I'm harping so much on that behavior is because that is really the most difficult part. Adding that level of accuracy is pretty easy. So something else that we'd want to consider here is whether or not you want to separate this out for oral versus written language. Depending on how many goals you have on your IEP, you may or may not want to separate that out. I usually favor efficiency over breaking this out into a ton of different goals. So I would be more likely to write one goal for syntax and target both oral and written within that goal and just keep separate data for both. But it's okay if you want to separate those out. I know some people prefer that. So what we can do now is that we could also consider whether or not we want to incorporate grammar into that as well. So I've even done something like student will say sentences with appropriate grammar and syntax on 4 out of 5 trials. So really here you want to find the balance between being efficient and specific enough that your goals don't include so many things that you can't track them, but at the same time, you don't want to write 100 goals that you're never going to be able to track. It's okay if you just target part of the goal and list the data that you have that indicates where your students are. And I know a lot of people will fight me on that efficiency rule, but I usually find that it's really hard for us to actually track all the different goals that we write on IEPs. So I think what happens then is that you end up feeling like you didn't accomplish anything throughout the school year, and you feel like a failure as a clinician because you didn't meet any of these goals. And really there's not really a benefit to anyone when you feel like that. So I always go with efficiency. The drawback of that, of course, is that you might find that for that goal with students will say sentences with appropriate grammar and syntax, well, maybe they might have only met part of the goal. And for example, a case with that would be if they've met the goal for oral language but not for written. If that's the case, you just update the goal and maybe make it a little bit more specific for the next year and just provide the data for the part of the goal that your student has mastered. So really, when it comes to writing goals for syntax for speech therapy, I always say follow the KISS principle, which is, of course, keep it simple, stupid. And obviously, I've also heard keep it simple, sweetie, whichever translation of that acronym works better for you. If you like the gentle approach, that's fine. But really, you want to keep it as simple as possible and keep your behaviors that you're listing in your goal as obvious as possible. All you're really doing when you are working on syntax is getting your students to say sentences correctly. So if you write a goal that says that your students will say a sentence with appropriate syntax, then you have covered your bases for syntax on your IEP. Now, what I'm going to do in the next articles is teach you how to make this goal a little bit more specific if you want to clarify that you are targeting one of those specific sentence types that I mentioned that tend to be difficult for students with language disorders. So again, those were sentences with passive voice, sentences with adverbial clauses and temporal or causal conjunctions, center-embedded relative clauses, or sentences with 3 or more clauses. So depending on where your student is, you may want to make your goal specific to one of those skills. And I can walk you through how to do that in the next couple articles. Now, of course, you are listening to a rebooted audio version of the first part of this blog post series, which is titled Syntax Goals for Speech Therapy Part 1. So what you could do is either just wait for me to reboot and give you the audio versions of the other blog posts, or you can actually find the just written versions of the blog posts. So it goes all the way from part 1 to 5, and I address how you can write goals for all of those different difficult sentence types. And I also talk about some strategies that you can use to address those skills as well. Additionally, I go way in depth into all of these different sentence types, and I have what's called the Ultimate Guide to Syntax, which is a written resource that includes over 100 different probes. There's actually 3 volumes, and it can be used to target all of those different sentence types. So it's a huge, massive printable resource that gives you a ton of different sentence probes at your fingertips. And that is available for members of the Language Therapy Advanced Premium Members Only community. So you either have 2 choices. You can check out the link to the Language Therapy Advanced Premium Members community and see the entire version of those ultimate guides, which really goes in depth into how to address all these different sentence types. Or you can check out the free blog post series where I give you an overview of how to address some of these sentence types, including what these sentence types actually are and the names of some evidence-based strategies that will help you address them. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thanks so much for listening. So again, if you want to check those out, you can check out those blog posts that have already been published, which I'll link to below this video, or you can go ahead and check out the Language Therapy Advanced Premium Members Program, where I go way more in depth and provide printable resources and tutorials that will lead you through how to address syntax so that you can improve your students' language comprehension. So thanks so much for listening, and feel free to leave comments below this video with any questions.